Alright, welcome back to the second part of our Angular Firebase chat application. When we left off in the previous video, we had just completed creating a basic version of our message component, and on our page we were able to show that we can post messages to Firebase and then of course display them on the page. So that's obviously really important functionality for our application, and so what I'd like to do now is to start applying some of our styling. And though the focus of this series of videos isn't really on CSS, I will go through the CSS files here that we're about to create just to show you sort of my line of thinking. Alright, so I'm going to minimize this, and before we do that I'm going to remove what we have in our existing message container and replace it with the actual markup that we'll be using in the initial version of this app. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll have a div that'll represent the left side of our chat bar, and that's going to contain our message sender, so the display name for the user who sends the message and then the timestamp. So let's just call that message data, I guess, just for lack of a better name. And then we're going to have two spans. So the first span that we'll have will be for our sender, and this is going to contain the username. That's on our component. And then the next span is going to contain the timestamp. And here, if you recall, we're actually passing our component a date object, so we can use a date pipe here and just specify the format using a built-in Angular pipe. And in this case, we will use the medium date format. Okay, so that's the left side of our message. Then for the right side of our message, that's going to be where the actual message body is contained. And so that's just our message content. Okay, so that will be the initial version of our message container here. Once we add authentication later in this video, we'll come back here and look at how we can dynamically change the styling on each of these elements here, so that if I, for example, a user, send a message, it's a different color than if another user in the chat room sends a message. But for now, this will handle the basic layout of our message component. So let's quickly take a look at our page, and everything is still rendering more or less properly. And yeah, so we have the username, we have this new date format that we're using an Angular pipe for, and we've got our messages that are coming out to the screen as well. So let's go ahead and start doing something about this styling here. So the first place I'm going to actually head into is the global styles.css file. So this is our style sheet where we can apply global stylings. So anything we define here will be defined across our entire application. So now I'm going to go ahead and paste in these global styles. And full disclosure, I'm definitely not a CSS expert by any stretch of the imagination. And so as we go through this, you may identify areas where you would do things differently. And certainly I probably would too if I went through this and revised it a second time. So maybe we'll save that as something to do towards the end of this series. But my goal here is just to get it to a presentable state and having it look nice and easy to work with, which it will be. There also may be places where we could do things a little bit more cleanly as well. So in any case, with that small disclaimer, I'll just quickly go through what we have here in the global styles. So I'm going to, by default, set all the elements height to 100% and use this box sizing border box. So setting the box sizing to border box is a nice way to work if you're building a template up from scratch, because it allows us to more intuitively set the size of our DOM elements. So say when we set the width of an element, by default CSS is probably going to use content box, and so that won't include the padding and border of that element when we set it. And so instead, when we set the box sizing to border box, when we specify the width or the height on that element, it's also going to include its border and padding values. Alright, so then we've got the body tag here with some pretty standard stuff. I had the background attachment fixed here because initially I had a background URL here. Alright, so for our first element selector here, we have one of our Angular components. So for our chat room, notice that I'm setting display here equal to flex. So we'll be using CSS Flexbox extensively throughout this application. I think it makes for a really nice, intuitive way to design and build layouts. And then we're going to set the flex direction on that component to column as opposed to row. And we can look at how that would change the look of our application if we play around with that a little bit later. That'll make more sense once we have all of our components set up and we get a sense for how everything's laid out. So then I'm going to have the navbar component and the chat form both with 100% width, and the chat form will have a flex display, and that's because I want the search bar and the button to take up the full width of the chat form component and have their individual sizing defined relative to each other. And then we've got a message component here which we're going to set to display block, so this is probably redundant if this message class is set on divs, but in any case that should work. And then we'll just set height to auto. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and save that. And so now let's head over into our app component CSS file. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and paste what I have here. Alright, so we have our chat header wrapper class. I'm going to set an explicit height there. We give it a bit of a box shadow here and set its z-index value to 2. And so that way it will be on top of some of the other elements in our DOM. Okay, and then we have our chat room class. And so I'm setting probably a redundant height of 100% here, and then we're setting the display to flex and the flex direction to column. And so we'll be applying flex styling to all of the child elements of chat room. And then I have a router outlet element selector here, and I'm just setting the height on that to 0. So this is because the router outlet will actually get rendered to the DOM, and I don't want it interfering with anything else that I have going on in the layout. And so we're just going to make its height 0 to avoid any of those sort of complications. So we'll head up here into chat room component CSS, and I'm going to go ahead and paste this in as well. If we go to the top, so I'm setting a flex display on the main content class and then also on the user list wrapper, and using a Google font here. And in a moment we'll go ahead and use the Google font CDN to bring this font into use in our application. And so yeah, some basic stuff here. We're setting the flex value here to 1. So this is essentially setting the flex grow property to 1. And some other fairly standard stuff here. I'm going to move the color up here. So this is setting the font color. And then the order property here is again for Flexbox, telling us what order this component appears relative to its sibling components. And then yeah, setting a background color here. Again, I'm going to move this up, and then some padding and a border on the right. Okay, so then our feed wrapper, this contains our feed component. Also setting the font here and making the font size a little bit larger and setting a flex grow value of 5 here. And then we specify it as being second in order inside of its container. And then I'm setting the overflow Y here to scroll. And so what this is going to do is it's going to create a scroll bar on that div such that when text overflows the div, we can continue reading it by scrolling through it. If we were to set it to auto, that would also work, I think, where the overflow would then generate a scroll bar once it extended the size of the div. In any case, we're going to just set it to scroll by default. And then yeah, so then we have a background color, and then I have this linear gradient that I'm applying over an image. And so you can see that I'm specifying a relative path to an image directory here in our assets folder. So let's go ahead and create that. So if we look over inside our source directory, you should have a directory called assets. So just go ahead and create a new folder in assets, and I named it IMG. And then I'm just going to drop some images in there that I'd like to use as background images for various parts of this application. So I'm just going to go ahead and drop those here. Feel free to find any images you'd like to use here and replace them, and also play around with, this linear gradient. Maybe you don't even prefer to use it at all, just to add a kind of interesting effect on the images that I'm using here. Okay, then some other basic stuff here that we've covered. Then I've got the chat form wrapper, and then this scroll style defined here as well. And so this is just going to be used to customize the scroll bar that's used in our feed, and we'll look at that in a little while. Now let's head over into our chat form component. So I'm going to go ahead and paste the CSS here, and some pretty basic styling going on here as well. So I'm going to set a rather large flex grow value for the chat input, which will be a sibling component to our chat button div. And so the flex value on that will be 1, while a flex grow value of 10 on our chat input. A bit of transition for when we focus on the chat input, as well as when we hover on the chat button. Okay, so pretty straightforward there. So let's go ahead and take a look at our feed, which should be here. And our feed's going to be really simple. So we just have a feed class with a display flex and direction column, and then a message class with direction column and a little bit of margin. And so this will apply a margin in between each of our chat messages, which just kind of keeps things looking nice and tidy. Alright, so let's take a look at our application so far. Alright, so it's starting to come together a little bit. You can see we have our messages here in the sort of feed area, and the nav bar is starting to look more like a nav bar. And you can see over here where we will eventually have the user list. So it looks like the next thing we should probably do is go ahead and style our messages here. So if we head into the message component CSS, okay, so I'm going to go ahead and paste in the CSS for our message component here. Okay, so first we have our message container class, and I have a flex display on that, and then the width of our message container will be 70%. Notice also that I'm setting the height here to auto, and that way the height of each message container will just be determined by the amount of text that's inside of it. And then notice I have this class isOwnMessageContainer, so this will be the class that we will dynamically apply to message containers that are sent by the current authenticated user. So the user that's actually sending the messages will have some unique styling applied to their message as opposed to the normal message containers, which will just be on all the other messages in the chat. And so we'll change the background color to this blue color. Then I have a message data class here that's just going to actually contain the sender and the timestamp. And so the sender class is just used to apply a color to the text and a bold font weight. And then when it is the user's own message being sent, then the background on that div will be darker, and so we'll have a lighter font color for it. Likewise on the timestamp, specifying a custom color when it is own timestamp. And then finally we have our message content. Again, just some basic styling, applying a little bit of border radius on the top right and the bottom right of this message box, setting a flex grow of 9 here with an auto height, and then when it is our own messages being sent, we'll have blue text with a very light blue background here. And so I'm going to scroll up here. Alright, cool. So let's actually go back into our message component here and go ahead and add this last class that we need here on this div for our message content, which is also just message content. And now let's go ahead and take a quick look at our page and see what it looks like. Alright, so we're getting much more reasonable results here. Also notice that if you type in enough messages to have overflow in your feed here, you should also be able to scroll. So that's looking pretty good. Okay, so the next thing I think that we should do here is to set up authentication for our application. So if you recall in the previous video, we set our sign-in method to email and password. Now I've had some requests also to take a look at authentication using Google and Facebook and some of the other social auth options. And the AngularFire package makes it extremely easy to actually authenticate using any of these methods. So that'll be something that I'd like to look at in a future video. But just to get our application working here, we'll start with email and password. And then, yeah, we can implement some of these other options once our application is working. So let's go ahead and create our sign up and login forms very quickly so that we can actually register some new users here. And once we do that, we'll be able to see them here in our users list. So we could add them from the console, but since we want to be able to register from our application anyway, let's just go ahead and take care of that now. So I'm going to minimize this, and then we're going to head over into our signup component. So let's check out Signup Form component.ts, and we're going to make another couple imports here. So we'll import router from @angular/router. And just gotta fix this typo here. And then we're also going to import our authentication service. And that's going to be one directory up in our services directory /auth.service. Okay, so we're going to export our signup form component, and we'll use 4 different properties on this component. So first of all, we'll have an email that the user will provide. We'll have a password, which will also just store as a string. And then we'll have a display name as a string and an error message that we can use in case there's some type of error while signing up. We can use this to display on the front end to the user. And then in our constructor here, I'm just going to go ahead and inject an auth service instance here and an instance of our router as well. And I'm not going to worry about doing anything on init here, so we can also just remove that, and we can remove this method. And this component is just simply going to have one, and go ahead and fix this typo, and I'll go ahead and get rid of this white space here. Alright, so we're just going to have a single method here on this component, which will just be sign up. And of course, we'll be using our authentication service in order to handle actually signing up and registering the new user with Firebase. All that our signup method here in the component is essentially a thin wrapper around a signup method that will exist in our authentication service. And we'll use it just to pass the params that the user passes in on a form on this component. So we'll have an email value equal to this email, and we're going to data bind that to a value that's coming in from the signup form. Same with a password. And then we'll have a display name. And so we're going to invoke the authentication service here, and we'll use a signup method on it. And so this is going to return a promise, but we're going to pass it the email, password, and display name to use. And so when that promise is resolved, we'll say then we're just going to use the router to navigate to the chat room. So that way when a user first signs up, they just get redirected directly over to the chat. And then in fact, we can also say .catch in case anything erroneous happens during the sign up process. We can set the error message equal to the message that gets returned here if that occurs. Okay, and so clearly we need to go ahead and write a signup method on our authentication service that we can use. And so we'll just need the email, password, and display name in order to set that up. So let's go ahead and head over to our authentication service class and create this signup method. So I'll head over into auth.service.ts, and I'll go ahead and make our imports here. So we'll import router, we'll import AngularFire auth, we'll import AngularFire database. I'm also going to import vanilla Firebase here as well. Oops. Then we're going to need to import observable again from RxJS. And then our custom user model, which is one directory up in our models directory, and then it's at user.model. Okay, so this is a service, so it will be injectable, of course. And we are going to have a private user on this class here, which will be an observable Firebase user. So firebase.user here. And then we'll have a private auth state, which I'll just set to any for right now. But this auth state will be an observable that we'll use to determine the authentication state of the current user. And so it will have a user ID on it that we can use to verify whether or not a user is logged in. Then we'll have a constructor here for the service, in which we'll inject our AngularFire auth instance, our AngularFire database, and our router. And I'm going to go ahead and clean this up a little bit, and go ahead and delete the duplicate constructor here. And then inside of our constructor, I'm just going to set this user equal to the auth state here. So let's go ahead and write our signup method. And if you recall, we need to pass that an email, password, and our user's chosen display name. And what we're going to return is an observable here using AngularFire authentication. And so we'll say that this AF auth, we have this auth property on it. And we have a method here. We have a lot of different methods here. But what we're going to do is create user with email and password. And for this, we just pass it the email and password that we've passed our method. Yeah, I said this was an observable. I believe it's a promise. And so we say then, and then we'll have an arrow expression here such that we are going to set our auth state now based on the return from this promise. So I'll set this.auth state to user. Okay, and before we get any further here, I'm also going to write a catch here for any errors that occur, and we'll just log them to the console right now. Okay, so when we sign up with our email and password, I do want to set the auth state here in our promise and catch any errors, and for now just log them out to the console. But what I'd also like to do is to also store the user's display name, email, and their current status, like whether or not they're online or not, in a live database. So, for example, at the time of this video, I'm not aware of any way, for instance, to get all of the users from Firebase authentication side of things. And so the way that I've decided to handle it for this app is to simply write out the users that sign up to a database record that we can refer to for, say, like their profile information or anything else that we'd like to add. In this case, we'll just register a simple display name, but of course you could imagine the user providing some other type of profile information, and for that we need to store it inside of a database anyway. So we're going to write a method for that, and I'm just going to call it setUserData, and we're going to pass it the email, their display name, and their status, and so we'll just define a constant status of online. So for this application we'll have a kind of a very crude present system that we could come back and actually make much better in the future. But for now we'll just go ahead and set the user status to online when they register, and we'll have to think about how to mark the user as offline, say if they lose connection or something. It would be easy enough to set their status to offline in our logout method when we write that. But we'd have to also look at how in general to set a user status depending on their current connection state to the application and not necessarily whether or not they've called a specific method. So in any case, this is what we'll do as a first pass. And so let's go ahead and write this method setUserData, which will take the user's email, display name, and status. And we could apply types to these methods as well. Just use TypeScript. And what I'm going to do now is go ahead and store the path in the database to my particular user. And so we'll put that user at user / and then just their user ID. And so how I'll handle getting the user ID is just with a method, current user ID, which we'll write here in just a moment. But first, for string interpolation here, I need a $. And then we'll create our object here to push to this particular place in the database, and we'll supply the properties. And I'm not sure if with the latest version of JavaScript whether or not we even need to set the properties like that, but I'm going to set them explicitly here. In any case, it's just something I recall seeing recently, and I could be wrong, so in any case we could definitely set it like this. And so then we can actually just use AngularFire database to update a particular object. So we used list earlier, so we saw that when we were retrieving a list of messages from the message part of our database, and so now we're going to have a separate parent node for all of the users in our database. And so we want to update a specific object. So we just provide the path to that object, which in our case will now be user / the current user ID, for which we need to write a method to get the current user ID. Then we're just going to update and provide this data object here, and we'll catch any errors and log them to the console. Okay, so now let's go ahead and figure out how we're going to get this current user ID. So that's actually going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to actually write this more towards the top of our class here. And so we'll write like get current user ID, which will be a string. And we're going to say if this .auth state is not equal to null, then return this .authState.uid, otherwise return an empty string. So we're just using a ternary operator here to say that if this .authState returns something, in other words, our user is authenticated, then return their unique user ID, otherwise return an empty string here. Okay, so while we're in our service here, let's go ahead and finish it out, since there's only a little bit more we'd have to do here to implement our login functionality. So I'm going to write a login method here, which will just take an email and a password. And then the way that the login is going to work is that we're also going to return a promise here. So this .afauth.auth.sign in with email and password, and we pass it the email and password, and it's a promise. So we'll write an arrow expression for this. And we'll set the status to online. Again, I know that this is really hacky. And we'll set the user status with an email and status. And then we'll navigate the user over to chat. Okay, and then our set user status will be another method, much like our set user data here, except that we won't be setting the display name. I just simply want to set an existing user's status to online, and we'll do that using their email here. And so this will be set user status. Oh. And I've completely written this inside of the set user data method by accident. Alright, so sorry about that. We'll come down here and right, I don't want to update anything except the user status, and so there's no need to pass an email either. We just pass the status for the current user ID, and then we set it to what we pass this method. Okay, and so current user ID is not working for us, and that's just because we have a typo here. Okay, with a lowercase d, so that should be working. And then set user status, yeah, we don't need to pass the email because we can just get the current user by their ID, because this should happen when they are authenticated. Okay, so we could also write a few more methods in here. Just to name a few, we could again implement social authentication in here. There's a method to send a user an email to reset their password. Perhaps we could implement all of that in a later video. But for now, let's go ahead and try to wire up our sign-in and our login forms. So I'll head over now to our sign-up form component. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and paste in our HTML for our sign-up form. We do have quite a bit of markup here, but it's all relatively straightforward. So first of all, I just have a container div, and then I've got a div with class signup card, which will wrap our form. And I'm using this template reference variable signup form here to access our ng form directive. And we just have a basic heading here that says sign up. And then we'll have an email, password, and display name, label, and input that our users will provide. And so a pretty straightforward input with a placeholder here. Then we have this two-way data binding to email, and we supply a max length. Do something very similar for password and display name. And then finally we have a button here, which we will apply a disabled directive to if the signup form is not valid. And then when the user clicks our signup button, the signup method in our component will get called, which of course invokes our authentication service. And so we'll be passing the display name, password, and email from our form here to our component, which we can see here. We store those as constants that we then pass to our signup method on our authentication service. And if that resolves without errors, then we navigate the user who has now been authenticated to our chat route. Okay, so let's go ahead and see if this will work for us. So we'll head back over to our application, and we don't have our navbar written yet, so I'm just going to go to /signup. And it looks like, as you can see, our layout looks pretty bad because we have that height of 100% set to everything, and we don't have our signup form CSS set up yet. So let's go ahead and actually complete the CSS on our signup form. So we can do this very quickly here, and I'll just go ahead and paste this in. And I won't go into too much detail about all of our selectors here for this, but I will scroll up so that you can see what I'm doing here. It's all very basic styling. So we've got our card and our form input, and then this container. And the container I am supplying a background image for, similar to the way that we did in our feed. So let's go back to the page. And okay, so our signup form is looking a little bit more reasonable, and my browser has saved a previous email and password combination, so we'll use that. And then for our display name, I'll just put my name here. Okay, and let's go ahead, and looks like we don't have any errors yet, so we'll click sign up and see if this works. And yeah, it looks like we have been redirected to our chat, which should mean that we are authenticated. So now if I go ahead and try to post a message, and hit enter, we come down and I'm still seeing test user here as being the user on this message. So let's go try to investigate and see what's going on here. So first of all, let's head over to our Firebase console and confirm that we do have a user who has been registered. If you're not seeing it in your user list, just go ahead and refresh the page here. So it looks like our form did register a user, and we have a user ID as well, and the email looks correct. So let's head over into our database where we can go ahead and minimize this, and we should see a users node here, which has a correct display name, email, and status of online. So it looks like functionally we have a working signup form. Let's go ahead and take a look at our message component and see if we can't determine why when I post the message I'm still getting test user. I'm going to minimize this and we'll look in our message component.html. And so I have a binding to the username. So if we head into message component.ts, so I recall now that we did some manual input of our username in the previous video before we had authentication set up. So probably in our chat service, if I scroll up, yeah, you can see I'm setting the username to test user. And so now I can go ahead and uncomment out this username property, which is calling this .username, and do the same for the email. And then be sure they're getting set here in the constructor. So we'll go ahead and uncomment out this code as well. So if you watch the previous video, you'll see that we implemented the ability to send messages before authentication was set up. And in order to get that working and show a username out in our message component, I just temporarily commented out our authentication code here. And so here we're subscribing to the auth state. And if it's not undefined or null, then we set the user to what gets returned here from this observable. So yeah, so this is actually just a Firebase.user. Okay, so now just to recap what send message is doing, we get the timestamp in email, and so that's all good. We're getting the email now on the authenticated user, and then we are getting all of the chat messages back from our database, and we're pushing this new chat message onto it. So the message itself will be passed to this function, then we grab that timestamp, we grab the user email, and so now we need to actually grab the authenticated user's display name or username. And so let's go ahead and in our constructor here, what I'm going to do after we set our user is to actually locate that user in our live database. So this is coming from Firebase authentication, but if you recall, our display name is stored in our live database. So I just want to very quickly revisit this just to show you here in our this is our live database where we store both messages and instances of our user objects here as well. And so I want to be grabbing this display name because this lives here. Over in Firebase authentication, I'll open this in a new tab. We just simply have a reference to the email address, when the user was created, and when they last signed in, and this user ID, but the display name isn't stored here. So what we need to do is to write a method that gets the user that's currently authenticated. And that's basically just going to be a reference to the user's path in our live database. So we're going to subscribe to that, and this will make sense in a moment here. We're going to set this .username equal to the, I should have called it also username in the database, but we called it display name. That's something else we could refactor for naming purposes. So I'm going to write this get user method. And we just need to get the currently authenticated user because that's the one that's sending messages, of course. So we'll say this .user is equal to this .user.uid. That's the user ID. And then the path to that user is, if you recall, it's in our users node, and then it is just at the user ID for that particular user. So if we look back at our database, this is the user ID here. And so all we're doing is just querying for this node here, which is going to contain the name. And the user ID that's currently logged in will have the user ID that we're looking for. So I can just return this .db and we can use that object again. thanks to Angular Fire Database, and pass it the path. So this will return an observable that we can subscribe to and set the username on the class here inside of a subscribe method. Okay, cool, so that should work. The other thing that we can actually do instead of our chat service while we're in here is we have a method to get the current user. We can also write a method to get all of the users, and this will be useful when we write our list here of users on the left side of our chat room. So we'll set a path to them here, and this will just be the root users path. And we can just return this .db.list this time, the path. So that's also a nice kind of way to see both the Angular Fire list and object methods on Angular Fire Database in use. So in the get users case, we just want to return a list of all the users at this path, and in the object case, we want to return the specific user object that exists at this path, corresponding to the specific user ID. All right, cool. So now we'll head back into our message component. So I'm gonna go ahead and, well, we can close out the template, and I'm also gonna close some of these other windows here. Okay, let's head into our message component TS file, and I'm also going to uncomment out isOwnMessage now. And we haven't done anything to really implement logic surrounding whether or not a particular message is a user's own message, but we will in just a few minutes. So let's go back to our page and go ahead and try to post another message. So I'll go ahead and hit enter and send here. And so now you can see that I'm getting my display name out to the page here. So that's looking good. Let's go ahead and try to register another user and then ensure that we can get another user supplying a message to the page. But in order to do that, actually, we would need to log out, and we might as well just write the nav bar now so that we can place a logout button here at the top. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll head over into our navbar component. We'll open up the template, and I'll remove the boilerplate code, and I'll go ahead and paste in some markup here. So I've got a navbar class. We've got our logo, which I will supply in just a moment. And we have our heading with the name base chat here. So this is just something I made up. There's no intentional relationship with any type of existing company or product with that name. And then I've got a div to contain our links. And so we can subscribe to that user property that we'll look at in just a moment. And that user would of course have a user ID. Then we're going to show this div, and so, show this anchor tag. And we just use that with the *ngIf directive here. And so when we click on this link, we'll have a method called login in our component, which of course will call upon once again our authentication service and log the user in. Likewise, we have something similar here for signup, which will just direct the user to the signup page. And again, if the user is authenticated, we'll say hello and pass in the user's email. And finally, if the user is signed in, we will also provide them with the ability to log out by calling a logout method. So let's go into the component. And so we'll import our auth service. I'll go ahead and import observable from RxJS and import vanilla Firebase as well. Okay, so as we saw from the template, I'm going to be using a user property here, which will be an observable Firebase user that we can subscribe to in the template using that async pipe. And then we'll have a user email, which we'll just set to a string. And in our constructor here, of course, we will be injecting an authentication service. And just to avoid any confusion, I will just call it auth service. And then inside of our ng on init, so when an instance of a navbar is created, we'll set this user equal to a method on our auth service called authUser, and we'll write that in just a moment here. And in fact, we'll also subscribe to it here to get the email. Okay, so pretty straightforward there. I'm not sure that we would even really need the if user, but I'll leave it here just for the time being. And then let's go ahead and write this authUser method. That's going to be ultra simple. It's just going to return the logged in user. So we'll head over into our auth service, and that is basically, and this will be essentially the most basic thing that the auth service should do, is just return this .user. Okay, and so that's pretty simple. Let's head into our navbar CSS. And I'll go ahead and paste the CSS in here. So again, nothing too fancy. We've got a width of 100% on it, and I will be using Flexbox to style it a bit. I have a logo that I made, which is just really horrible and very simple. So feel free to make your own logo if you like, or I'll post a PNG up on GitHub as well. And yeah, we're setting it as a background to a container div that has an ID of logo, and then just setting the background size to cover, and then explicitly setting a height and a width on this image, which is already square, so that should just provide us with an ability to size that logo as needed. And if you have really good design skills and can work with SVGs, then you could make this even nicer. Okay, in any case, then I have some basic styling on a heading ID, and then a links class where we just apply some padding to the links that are in our navbar, and then all of our links that have a parent with an element of ID heading, and then all anchor tags which exist inside an element of class links. Just setting some color and turning off the default underline that exists on anchor tags, setting a hover value to change the color, and applying a little bit of transition there, and then something very basic for the user email ID. Okay, so that's all looking good. So let's go ahead and take a look back at our page now, and we should have a navigation bar. Okay, so yeah, we have our nav bar set up. We have the default fonts, so what I'm going to do is head over to Google Fonts, and we'll just come here, and I'll go ahead and bring in Open Sun, and then I think I was also using Roboto and Droid Sun somewhere. Okay, so probably a bit excessive use of fonts here. In any case, we'll go ahead and grab this. It looks like Google Fonts has updated their styling here recently. Okay, so now I'm going to come down into our index.html, and inside of our head tag, go ahead and paste in a link to the CDN here. So go ahead and save that. Come back to our page. Yeah, so we get a little bit nicer fonts happening on our page now.